Can a urinal be art? What about a random newspaper collage or nonsense poetry shouted in a smoky bar? If that sounds absurd, you've already met Dada. Art has always carried rules, whether whispered or written in textbooks. Painters were expected to paint with skill, poets to rhyme with elegance, sculptors to carve with patience. But by the early 20th century, those rules felt suffocating. Imagine walking into a gallery where every canvas looked like the last, refined, polished, predictable. People admired the beauty, but many quietly wondered if beauty alone was enough to capture the chaos of their world. And chaos was everywhere. World War had torn Europe apart. Death tolls rose daily. Governments stumbled. Faith and rationality, the very foundation of Western culture, was collapsing. How could neat landscapes or tidy portraits possibly speak to the madness of trenches, machine guns, and gas masks? Art felt polite in a world that was anything but polite. That frustration lit the fuse. A group of writers, painters, and performers began asking, what if art didn't need rules at all? What if the very idea of art was just a game society invented, and now it was time to flip the board? The movement soon called Dada wasn't offering polished masterpieces. It was offering something more dangerous, the chance to burn down every certainty about culture, beauty, and meaning. Instead of comfort, Dada gave people a mirror of nonsense, chaos, and laughter at the absurdity of existence. And once that door opened, it never closed again. The year was 1916. Switzerland, neutral and away from the war front, became the unlikely stage for rebellion. In Zurich, a dim nightclub called the Cabaret Voltaire opened its doors. It wasn't glamorous or wealthy, but it pulsed with restless energy. Refugees, writers, and artists escaping the bombs crowded inside. Here, the rules of art unraveled. Performances weren't polished recitals but chaotic spectacles. Poets shouting gibberish, musicians banging without harmony, actors delivering lines out of sync while audiences either laughed or stormed out. To outsiders, it looked like madness. To those inside, it was freedom. Even the name Dada reflected that freedom. Legend says it came from stabbing a knife into a dictionary and landing on a childish word, Dada, nonsense, meaningless. And yet in that meaninglessness, it became a weapon. If war and politics were absurd, why should art pretend to be logical? The world outside was collapsing into bloodshed. Inside, Dadaists turned collapse into performance. Their art wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense. It was raw, mocking, like a prank against culture itself. They pasted scraps of newspapers into jagged collages, made nonsense manifest as truth, and declared that a urinal signed or mutt could be sculpture simply because an artist said so. Yet beneath the laughter, there was pain. These were people watching civilization self-destruct. Their chaos wasn't random, it was a reflection of the outside world. Every strange poem, every absurd performance, every broken rule carried the same whispered question. If the world has lost its mind, why should art remain sane? What began as protest in one small nightclub soon spread. Dada became a virus of ideas infecting Berlin, Paris, and New York. Each city twisted it into its own form. But one thing stayed constant. Dada existed to attack the very definition of art. Marcel Duchamp pushed that attack the furthest. He introduced ready-made, ordinary objects lifted from daily life and declared art. A bicycle wheel mounted on a stool, a bottle rack placed in a gallery, and of course, the infamous urinal signed R. Mutt, type of fountain. At first it seemed like a crude joke, but Duchamp's point was sharper. Is art about the object itself, or the idea behind it? College artists carried the same spirit. They sliced newspapers, ads, and propaganda into fragments, pasting them into confrontations rather than pretty compositions. Höch, for example, used cutouts to expose the absurdity of politics and gender roles, dismantling the very images meant to control public thought. Dada wasn't just absurdity, it was a mirror, one that forced the world to see its own madness. On stage, the rebellion was just as fierce. At Dada performances, audiences were pelted with insults or bombarded by nonsense poems shouted in multiple languages. The goal wasn't applause. It was to shatter expectations of what performance could be. To critics, it looked like vandalism of culture. To Dadaists, it was liberation. Every object, every word, every act could be transformed into art if it carried intention. They weren't just making works to admire. They were making a statement, The rules you think are sacred. They're not real. We can tear them down and start again. But here's where the tension grew sharper. If anything can be art, where do we draw the line? Without limits, does the idea collapse into nothing? That question haunted Dada from the beginning, and it never really went away. By the 1920s, Dada wasn't a fringe movement anymore. It was a cultural earthquake. Newspapers covered it, critics argued endlessly, and audiences crowded in to see what shocking stunt might happen next. But Dada wasn't absurdity for absurdity's sake. Its chaos worked like a mirror, reflecting the madness of a world still reeling from war. Think of it, battlefields filled with senseless destruction, echoed by artists tearing newspapers into shreds. Nonsense poetry that sounded like the babble of politicians justifying slaughter. Laughter at tradition that matched the public's loss of faith in authority. In Berlin, artists like George Grosz and John Hartfield sharpened that mirror into a weapon. Their biting collages mocked politicians, exposed corruption, and attacked blind obedience. These weren't pretty decorations for a living room. They were warnings, visual protests cut and pasted into sharp truths. Meanwhile, in Paris, Dada began to morph. Some artists leaned further into performance, staging chaotic shows where the audience became part of the spectacle. Others started to drift toward something new, surrealism, with its dreamlike visions and subconscious explorations. In that way, Dada didn't just reflect the absurdity of the present. It cracked open a door to the future of modern art. But Dada's mirror was uncomfortable. It forced people to confront an ugly truth. Society itself was irrational, violent, and absurd. And if society was broken, then maybe the systems that upheld it, politics, culture, even art, deserved to be mocked, dismantled, and rebuilt. Still, here's the suspense. When you smash every rule, when you turn the sacred into a joke, what happens when the joke stops being funny? Could Dada survive once its shock value wore off? Or would it fade, leaving only echoes behind? By the mid-1920s, the Dada movement had begun to fragment. The original energy, the raw rebellion against war, tradition, and meaning itself, couldn't burn at that intensity forever. Some artists drifted into surrealism, exploring dreams and the unconscious. Others returned to more traditional forms, carrying the echoes of Dada with them. And some simply disappeared, their shock tactics no longer stirring the same outrage. But while the performances stopped and the clubs closed, the questions Dada raised never went away. In fact, they became the foundation of modern and contemporary art. Every time a painter splashes a canvas with raw emotion, every time a sculptor assembles junkyard scraps into something strange, every time a performance artist screams or laughs or stages something that seems ridiculous, Dada is there in the background, whispering, "Remember, the rules are not sacred." The legacy of Dada is paradoxical. On the one hand, it liberated art forever. No longer could critics insist that only oil on canvas counted, or that technical mastery alone determined value. Dada taught us that intention, context, and even humor could transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. On the other hand, Dada left behind a haunting question. If anything can be art, does that mean nothing truly is? When Duchamp placed a urinal in a gallery, he wasn't just mocking tradition. He was planting a seed of doubt that still divides people today. Is art about beauty, skill, and meaning, or is it simply about the choice to call something art? And here's where we land in suspense. Dada may have ended as a movement, but its ghost lingers in every museum and every debate. Walk through a gallery of contemporary pieces, neon lights, piles of dirt, silent performances, and you'll hear the same murmurs. Is this art? The fact that we're still asking a century later means Dada won. It permanently rewired our expectations, and it left us with a challenge we've never fully resolved. Because in the end, the movement that began with nonsense syllables and absurd performances wasn't just mocking the world. It was asking us to confront it. And whether you see brilliance or foolishness, Dada forces you to decide for yourself. What is art, and what isn't? So here's where we land. Dada wasn't about skill, polish, or beauty. It was about tearing open the definition of art itself. It dared to laugh in the face of war, to mock authority, and to remind us that meaning is fragile, maybe even invented. And that's why, more than 100 years later, we're still haunted by its question. If anything can be art, where do we draw the line? That's the power of Dada. It never gave us an answer. It left us with a mirror, one we can't look away from. The world is still messy, chaotic, and absurd, and every time we call something art, we're stepping into the argument Dada began. So now, the challenge is yours. When you see something strange in a gallery, when you stumble on a piece of performance or a random object turned into a display, ask yourself, is this a scam or is this freedom? That decision isn't up to critics anymore. It's up to you. If this story made you rethink what art can be, drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you would call art and what you'd never accept. And if you want more stories that uncover the movements that shook culture, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Because next time, we'll dive into another moment where the world turned upside down and never looked the same again.